Also on the point today, last Friday, the Ministry of Commerce announced that China will impose temporary anti-dumping tariffs on wine imported from Australia. Australia has called China's move grossly unfair and unwarranted and is filing complaints at the WTO. China denies that the new tariffs are a punitive strategy, saying its measures are in line with Chinese laws and regulations and international customary practices. So what's really going on and what lies behind current tensions, and where are China-Australia relations heading? Joining me for the discussion from Shanghai, we have Chen Hong, Director of Australian Studies Center at East China Normal University, and from Darwin via Skype, Daryl Guppy, CEO of GuppyTraders.com. Gentlemen, so good to have you on today. Professor Chen, I want to start with you. According to Chinese Ministry of Commerce, China will impose temporary anti-dumping tariffs of up to 212% on wine imported from Australia starting November 28th. What do you make of this move from Beijing?
Well, one thing I must point out is that this is not formally a kind of tariff. This is actually a temporary measure which actually will be demanding a kind of so-called deposits from the exporters of Australian wine into China, because actually the anti-dumping investigation is still going on. China actually announced to start the anti-dumping investigation in late August, and the investigation is supposed to be going on for one year. So in other words, the investigation is still going on, but China is actually making an assessment that acts of anti-dumping really exists and is still really very operative in Australia. That is why actually the temporary measure to counter the acts of dumping of Australian wine is happening. That is starting to take effect, last weekend. That is what is happening. So far, actually, China is finding actually acts of, subsidy and also, government subsidy, as well as various other kinds of ways to subsidize, growers of, the owners of vineyards and also the breweries. So all those actually contribute to the Australian wine to be selling in the Chinese market cheaper than their cost. That is why actually China is imposing this temporary measure, which is actually in the hope that actually that will be curbing such kind of wanton acts. But of course, obviously, as you said, that the Australian society is actually making accusations that actually China is making a mistake. So whatever will be happening will be in due accordance with Chinese laws and regulations, as well as the in accordance with WTO procedures. So everything will be carried out in a rules-based order.
There seems to be a sharp contrast in understanding whether Australian wine is being dumped here in China. Mr. Guppy, Professor Chen just pointed out the temporary nature of the tariffs being applied here. Can I get your reaction also to this latest move from Beijing, which will no doubt exacerbate things between the two sides?
That's true, and like many Australians, I find it very difficult to understand, as I pay far more for Australian wine in Beijing than I pay for the same wine in Australia. If the complaint had been about price gouging with excessive profit margins, then it'd be much easier to believe. So many Australians see this as an unfair attack on Australian wine production. But more importantly, it makes all Australian business nervous about doing future business in China.
Let's talk about the impact on Australian businesses, because after the new duties were announced, share prices of some major Australian wine sellers plummeted. According to government marketing body Wine Australia, China is the biggest buyer of Australian wine, importing about 1.2 billion Australian dollars worth of wine in a year through September. And that's 167% more than Australia exports to the U.S., its second biggest market. All these data, Professor Chen, tell us how important a market China is to Australian wine. Given this, how hard will the new tariffs hit Australia's wine industry?
Well, the Australian wine industry has been, working very hard over the years to develop their Chinese markets. Previously, obviously, the Chinese, wine market has been largely, opening to the European, wine industry. But with the efforts made by jointly, by Chinese importers, as well as obviously the Australian winemakers, as well as of course the Chinese consumers, Australian wine is actually gaining ground in the Chinese markets, and in fact, actually, Australian wine is taking actually at the top notch among the imported wines in China. But regretfully, as the Chinese Ministry of Commerce has pointed out, there are some acts of dumping as contained in the process of gaining the market access by the Australian wine exporters. That is why the anti-dumping measures are being taken as a way to protect the local wine making industry, as well as to make the Chinese wine market to be more sanguine in a more healthy way. But obviously that will be really according to the Australian the head of the Australian Department of Finance and also Commerce, Simon Birmingham. He said that actually these measures will be devastating to Australia's wine industry, which I do agree. I think actually as a way to rectify the current situation, I think the Australian side need to make concrete measures to to stop the unfair subsidization, and also to make the exporting industry to be developing in a more healthy way.
Mr. Guppy, no doubt winemakers in Australia will feel the pinch of these measures, which will make it very difficult to market and sell their products in China. But will their grievances be heard by Canberra? How does Canberra plan to address whether it's nervousness felt by Australian businesses or actual pains felt by winemakers in Australia?
Well, one of the interesting things is that, of course, many wine companies, including those that are owned by an increasing number of Chinese investors, they'll possibly go out of business. These tariffs deprive the Chinese consumer of choice. And, more importantly, they destroy business cooperation and friendships that have been built up over many, many years. And I return to my original comment. Why is wine much, much more expensive in Beijing than it is in Australia? This is the exact opposite of what dumping is involved. So there needs to be some sitting down at the table and some good discussion about exactly what is happening. Now, you were quite correct. These are precautionary tariffs that have been raised. They're not the final tariffs, but they are pending discussion in the WTO, which is where the appropriate place is for this to be discussed. But we are very concerned that these have been put on as precautionary tariffs because it affects everybody.
Professor Hong, what do you make of the chances of the two sides sitting down to talk it out, given the current tensions between Beijing and Canberra?
Well, first of all, I should point out that Australia has been imposing a lot of anti-dumping, the so-called anti-dumping tariffs over Chinese products. Over the years, there are 106 cases of the so-called anti-dumping tariffs imposed upon Chinese imports, from ranging from Chinese steel products to A4 paper made by Chinese producers. But altogether in China, from China, altogether there are only 4 cases of anti-dumping complaints or grievances. So in comparison, we can clearly see, which side is actually really making use of this kind of, the so-called, anti-dumping measures as a way of, weaponizing, trade frictions. I think actually in international businesses, there are a lot of, occurrences in which, trade disputes and frictions will be happening. And indeed, there are due processes to be going through, of course, two sides, business to business, partner to partner. There should be, open and frank exchanges of opinions. For example, like, just in recent weeks, the Chinese embassy actually provided a list of grievances that Chinese side feel, to be, the Australian side had been, doing unfairly towards China. But actually, Australian side is accusing that as kind of, coercion. But definitely that's not the case. So frank exchange of opinions are definitely important, but also, we should be doing this in the legal, legal way, through the legal process.
Mr. Guppy, can I get your help understanding the attitude of Canberra now? Because in a speech last week, Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison sent what were regarded as positive signals toward Beijing. He talked about happy coexistence and praised China's achievements in poverty alleviation. At that time, many thought, well, maybe this could turn pages. And these signals were picked up by people here in China. But at the same time, he recommitted Australia to its enduring alliance with the U.S. Where do the two sides stand as we speak?
Okay, I need to first of all address the Professor's comment, and yes, Australia is the third most frequent user of anti-dumping procedures, and that's not necessarily a good thing. However, we all try and stay within the rules of the WTO. A balance between trade and defence relationships is possible. Now remember, Australia did this successfully for many decades, but in recent years Australia has become more strident in its criticism of China and less diplomatic. China shows exactly how this type of trade and defence relationship can proceed, both smoothly and diplomatically. President-elect Biden provides an opportunity to work in a multilateral environment and seek a multilateral solution. Now, Australia will need to join this movement and reject the way that it has rather closely followed Trump in loudly attacking China in recent years. The real problem, I suspect, is that Australia believed it was indispensable to China, and that therefore Australia could loudly criticise China with impunity in a way that showed little respect. No country can tolerate that approach, and that applies both ways, both for Australia's treatment of China and China's treatment of Australia. We need to dial down the dialogue and resort to diplomacy to resolve these issues.
Professor Chen, now that Australia wants to take matters to the WTO, how will things likely play out?
Well, the Simon Birmingham actually made the explicit threat to make an appeal to the WTO regarding the case of the China's anti-dumping measures regarding barley, not wine, but actually over barley, because the wine investigation is still going on. So actually, China is imposing 80% of tariffs over Australian barley. So actually, that process actually is, of course, obviously an explicit threat made by the Australian side. I think actually China will respect rules and also respects the laws in the legal system. If actually in the event that Australia will really take the case to the WTO, actually China will definitely be going through the process in accordance with laws and regulations. China will be respecting the procedures and also will be respecting the rulings. But China will definitely be making a strong case that there are acts of dumping with regard to barley from Australia.
Well, with that, I'm afraid that's all the time we have on the show today. Mr. Daryl Guppy, Professor Chen Hong, thank you so much for your participation. And that is the point today. As always, follow us on Facebook and Twitter using the handle Lucian in Beijing, and download the CGTN app to watch our show, or go to YouTube and look for CGTN The Point. I'm Lucian in Beijing. Thank you for the privilege of your time.